Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called the Secretary of State a glorified messenger boy in a congressional hearing room with 11 cameras broadcasting live. She leaned aggressively into the microphone, looking down at the man sitting entirely alone at the witness table, and delivered the rest of her blistering critique, telling him that he doesn't set policy, that he doesn't make decisions, and that he merely sits on a couch while the president yells at world leaders before flying off somewhere to clean up the mess. So let's skip the prepared remarks and talk about the mess, she demanded, prompting laughter from the gallery. Out in the hallway, her legislative director was watching the exchange on a tablet and immediately typed 3 confident words into a group chat. She's cooking. The Congresswoman had meticulously prepared 11 precise questions, each engineered to land in under 20 seconds, purposely leaving no breathing room for the bureaucratic, diplomatic non-answers that every Secretary of State before him had utilized to simply run out the clock. The operative strategy was simple yet brutal. She would ask all 11 questions, and he would be able to answer none of them. That calculated plan worked flawlessly for the first 4 inquiries. But on the 5th question, the dynamic violently fractured. Marco Rubio stopped answering and started asking. It was the first time in 6 relentless years that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had been asked a question she could not immediately extinguish with the procedural shield of the words, "reclaiming my time." The House Foreign Affairs Committee oversight hearing had been dragging on for an exhausting 3 hours and 14 minutes. Marco Rubio had been sitting alone at the isolated witness table for the entire duration, confined to 1 chair, 1 microphone, and 1 nameplate that read Secretary of State with a single water glass he had methodically refilled twice. Directly across from him, arranged in an imposing, raised semicircle of heavy mahogany and polished brass nameplates, 23 members of Congress physically looked down at him from the dais. The intimidating geometry of the room was entirely deliberate. They sat above, he sat below, they asked, he answered, they controlled the ticking clock, and he did not. 14 committee members had already burned through their allotted 5 minutes. Rubio had answered each of their inquiries exactly the way every Secretary of State answers standard oversight questions, with practiced diplomatic precision, utilizing careful hedges and crafting complex sentences that traveled a great rhetorical distance without ever actually arriving anywhere. I appreciate the question, Congressman, and that's a matter we're actively reviewing, or I'd be happy to have my team follow up with your office. These phrases were the bureaucratic lubricant explicitly designed to make 5/10 minutes pass without any actual friction. Rubio applied these deflections with the mechanical, unbothered ease of a veteran who had spent 14 years in the Senate and implicitly understood that congressional oversight hearings were not designed to produce genuine answers, but rather to produce viral clips. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was positioned as the 15th questioner, intentionally placed last on the list. She had been sitting on the elevated dais for over 3 hours, quietly watching 14 of her colleagues ask questions and receive perfectly hollow answers that contained absolutely no actionable information. She had watched every single one of them frustratingly run out of time, as Rubio systematically outlasted them all, not by aggressively fighting back, but by patiently waiting them out. She absolutely did not intend to be the 15th person he successfully outweighted. When the committee chair finally recognized her, she intentionally did not begin with customary greetings or polite protocol, nor did she thank the secretary for his time. Instead, she leaned sharply forward, found the red light of the C-SPAN camera, and strategically spoke right past Rubio to the massive audience beyond the sterile walls of the room, executing the exact tactic she always used to speak directly to the people watching rather than the people present. Mr. Secretary, how many U.S. aid programs were terminated in the first 6 months of this administration? She demanded. As Rubio shifted his weight in his chair and began to answer, Congresswoman, The restructuring of U.S. aid was part of a broader effort to ensure that American taxpayer dollars are directed toward programs that demonstrably advance. She cut him off with surgical precision. 47, she stated definitively. The answer is 47 programs, including 3 maternal health initiatives in Central America that your own department rated as highly effective. Is that efficiency, Mr. Secretary, or is that cruelty with a spreadsheet? She fired, completely refusing to wait for an answer. She quickly glanced at the digital clock mounted on the dais, noting 4 minutes and 31 seconds remaining, and ruthlessly moved forward. You personally advocated for the capture of President Maduro in Venezuela, she stated, adding, you called it, and I quote, a victory for freedom. How many Venezuelan citizens have received humanitarian aid since the operation began? As Rubio opened his mouth to explain that, the situation in Venezuela is complex, and the humanitarian, she slammed the procedural door shut. Reclaiming my time, she delivered the devastating fact. The answer is fewer than before the operation. Your department's own quarterly report says so. Page 14, paragraph 3. I have it right here. She dramatically held up the printed page, deliberately not reading from it, but displaying it the way a trial lawyer holds up a damning exhibit so the television camera can capture the indisputable fact that she possesses the proof while the man trapped below her does not. Moving to her third question, she deliberately changed her vocal tone, adopting a softer cadence which proved significantly more dangerous than her previous sharpness, primarily because Ocasio-Cortez at her most lethal was always Ocasio-Cortez at her most intimate and personal. Mr. Secretary, your department expanded sanctions on Cuba in May. She began noting that Cuban hospitals were reporting critical medicine shortages. Then she brought the political warfare right to his doorstep. Your parents came from Cuba. Your mother was a housekeeper. Your father was a bartender. They came to this country for a better life. She let a heavy pause hang in the room. The silence was masterfully calculated, timed down to the exact second, delicately placed right between the personal and the political, striking with the precision of a blade sliding cleanly between ribs. Do Cuban children deserve medicine, Mr. Secretary, or do they deserve sanctions? She asked. Up in the viewing gallery, someone audibly exhaled, while down in the press row, a Huffington Post reporter feverishly began composing a viral headline. AOC turns Rubio's own family story against him. Down at the witness table, Rubio's hands were planted completely flat on the wooden surface, his fingers spread wide and palms pressed firmly down. It was the defensive posture of a man exerting immense physical effort to hold something firmly in place, or perhaps holding his own temper in check. His eventual answer emerged measured, remarkably careful, and deeply diplomatic. No child anywhere in the world deserves to suffer, and our sanctions are specifically designed to target the regime, not the poor. But she predictably severed his sentence with a sharp, reclaiming my time. Charging into question 4, she pivoted to global diplomacy, Munich. At the Munich Security Conference, you told European allies, and I quote, we Americans may sometimes come off as a little direct. She relentlessly hammered him with consecutive hypothetical timelines. Was that before or after this administration threatened to withdraw from NATO? Was that before or after the president called the EU, your allies, the ones you were reassuring, worse than China? As Rubio simply began to respond, AOC confidently glanced up at the ticking clock, registering 2 minutes and 44 seconds remaining, and allowed a triumphant smile to cross her face. She wasn't smiling at Rubio. She was smiling directly at the camera, projecting the unmistakable confidence of a woman who had spent 6 years practicing the dark art of turning 5-minute congressional interrogations into a national political career, knowing with the absolute certainty of a seasoned performer who has executed this maneuver 100 times that she was undeniably winning the exchange. And she truly was winning for exactly 11 more seconds. Question 5 arrived with a distinctive theatricality that characterized all of Ocasio-Cortez's best traps, featuring a sudden pivot, a dramatic shift in vocal register, and a clear signal to the rapt audience that the real ideological ambush was finally coming. Mr. Secretary, you have repeatedly called democratic socialism a political philosophy supported by millions of Americans and practiced successfully across Scandinavia, she stated. You have called it, and I quote, a threat to the American way of life. I want to give you an opportunity to walk that back. Do you stand by that statement? Having delivered her payload, she sat back in her large leather chair and confidently folded her arms, embodying the dominant body language of a prosecutor who has just asked the ultimate question she came to ask and is now fully prepared to watch the target's answer spectacularly fail on live television. But Marco Rubio absolutely did not give a diplomatic, focus-grouped answer. In that razor-thin moment, something fundamental shifted, not merely the atmosphere in the cavernous room, but something deep within the man himself. The careful, rigid posture he had maintained for the past 3 grueling hours noticeably loosened. The measured, bureaucratic cadence that had flawlessly carried 14 previous non-answers completely dissolved. His hands, which had been pressed intensely flat against the mahogany table, slowly turned over, resting palms up and completely open, displaying the vulnerable yet defiant gesture of a man who is no longer trying to hold something back, but is finally ready to let something visceral out. Congresswoman, I don't call it a threat because I read about it in a textbook, Rubio began, his voice devoid of the usual Washington artifice. The suffocating diplomatic grammar rapidly fell away, stripping the subordinate clauses, the careful hedges, and the obligatory, with all due respects, leaving behind only the raw, unvarnished essence of Miami. What vividly remained was the memory of a crowded kitchen table where his grandfather once sat, with thick cigar smoke curling slowly around his calloused fingers, recounting dark stories that were absolutely not bedtime stories, but rather solemn depositions, eyewitness testimony from a hard life, lived under the exact ideological system that the polished woman sitting up on the dais was currently selling to naive 2 0-year-olds on Instagram. My father was a bartender, Rubio stated firmly. He made drinks for people who could afford to buy them. My mother was a housekeeper. She cleaned rooms in hotels she could never afford to sleep in. He locked eyes with his interrogator, the political theater fading into something intensely personal. They left Cuba because a man who talked exactly the way you talk about equality, about the people, about fighting oligarchy, took everything their family had and told them it was for the greater good. That man's name was Fidel Castro. The tension in the room spiked as Rubio delivered the historical punchline. And the first thing he did, after giving his speeches about equality, was move into the largest estate in Havana. He paused, though noticeably not for rhetorical effect, but because the heavy sentence that needed to come next required a fundamentally different kind of air to properly execute. So when you ask me whether democratic socialism is a threat, I don't need a policy brief, he declared. I need a phone call to my mother. Ocasio-Cortez immediately sensed the lethal danger of the narrative slipping from her control and leaned aggressively back into her microphone, attempting to forcefully corral the exchange. Mr. Secretary, I asked a specific policy question about Scandinavian models she started, but Rubio drove right through the interruption. And I'm giving you a specific answer, he countered, his voice steady and resolute. You asked if I stand by my statement. I stand by it because I've seen the ending. You're selling Chapter 1. My family lived through Chapter 10. Upon those words, the massive room visibly recalibrated, not with a loud sound, but with an undeniable physical shift in weight. as 23 powerful members of Congress uncomfortably adjusted in their high-backed chairs. Up in the public gallery, 200 enraptured people simultaneously leaned 2 degrees forward, while the robotic mounts of the 14 broadcast cameras made frantic micro-adjustments that absolutely no one heard, but every single person intensely felt. Flustered but determined to regain the upper hand, Ocasio-Cortez frantically looked at the digital clock, which mercilessly displayed 1 minute and 51 seconds, reclaiming my time. Mr. Secretary, I asked about policy, not personal anecdotes. She fired back dismissively. Rubio was entirely unmoved. Congresswoman, you ask me why I believe democratic socialism is a threat. My family is the answer to your question. Would you like me to stop answering your question? She attempted to pivot hard back to academic safety. I would like you to answer the question I asked, which is about Scandinavian economic models and whether, but Rubio immediately shut down the escape route. You asked me if I stand by my statement. I do. I told you why, he stated flatly. Then he executed a maneuver that would permanently alter the trajectory of the hearing. Now, since you mentioned oversight, I'd like to conduct some, he declared, pivoting the scope of the inquiry directly onto his interrogator. Mr. Secretary, this hearing is about the State Department, Ocasio-Cortez interjected, attempting to hide behind procedural boundaries. This hearing is about oversight, accountability. Rubio's response was chillingly precise. And if you can oversee my department, Congresswoman, I can certainly examine how the woman lecturing me about equality spends her campaign funds. In that exact second, the very fabric of the room permanently changed. Not gradually, but all at once, violently mirroring the sudden energetic shift in a tense courtroom when a star witness unexpectedly steps out of the physical witness box and confidently walks straight toward the jury. Rubio himself had physically not moved an inch. He was still sitting down in the low chair, positioned far below the imposing dais, totally physically beneath the raised semicircle of brass nameplates and sensitive microphones. The strict architectural geometry of the chamber had absolutely not changed, but something fundamental inside that very geometry had completely inverted, and every single breathing person in the room instantly felt it, even if no one could have immediately explained the mechanics of the reversal. The man confined in the low chair was no longer playing the role of answering. He had seized absolute control and was now asking. Panicked, Ocasio-Cortez shot a desperate look at the powerful chair of the committee, but the chairman merely looked down at his heavy wooden gavel and made the deliberate choice not to pick it up. The Secretary of State was technically responding to an open question about oversight, making his unprecedented response completely germane to the proceedings. Furthermore, his vocal tone remained completely measured, leaving the strict parliamentary rules completely devoid of any solid grounds for the chair to forcibly intervene. The wooden gavel remained completely silent on the wood. Out in the marbled hallway beyond the heavy wooden doors, Ocasio-Cortez's legislative director was now standing straight up, gripping her tablet tightly in both hands, wide-eyed and watching the digital screen with the horrified paralysis of a person watching a catastrophic car accident that hasn't quite happened yet, but is absolutely about to occur. She frantically texted the core communications team, "He's going off script. What does he have?" But received absolutely no reply, primarily because no one in the sprawling apparatus actually knew. For over 3 grueling hours, Marco Rubio had dutifully answered every single incoming question, exactly like a trained diplomat, but now he was unleashed and answering exclusively like a son. You co-sponsored a tour called Fighting Oligarchy with Senator Sanders in 2025, Rubio stated with chilling accuracy, notably not reading from a prepared folder or glancing at a glowing laptop screen. He was speaking directly from a deeply internalized place that required absolutely no paper notes, because the devastating numbers he was about to weaponize were not abstract data points he had casually researched. They were visceral, brutal calculations he had been actively making in his head for his entire life. You stayed at the Vidara Hotel and Spa in Las Vegas, $3,500 a night. Campaign funds, he noted. He let a pause hang in the thick air, deploying it not for theatrical dramatic effect, but rather conversationally, evoking the familiar cadence of a tired man pausing over a worn kitchen table before finally voicing something deeply personal he had been brooding about for a very long time. My mother cleaned rooms at a hotel like that in Las Vegas, not the Vidara, the Riviera. Before they tore it down, she cleaned 14 rooms a day. She made $7.25 an hour, he recalled, locking eyes with a congresswoman. At that rate, your one night at the Vidara cost 483 hours of my mother's labor. He absolutely did not raise his voice. He fundamentally did not need to, as the raw mathematics of the situation did all the devastating heavy lifting. Relentlessly, he read the damning ledger. Leo Kent Hotel, Tucson, $3,100. That's 427 hours. Hotel Palacio Provincial, San Juan, multiple stays, $4,000 a night, 552 hours. He leaned slightly forward, weaponizing the contrast. Every one of those rooms was cleaned by a woman like my mother, a woman who takes 2 buses to work at 4 inches the morning, a woman who strips sheets and scrubs toilets and makes beds so tight you could bounce a quarter off them. His gaze hardened as he delivered the fatal comparison, and the woman sleeping in that bed, on those sheets, in that room, was flying across the country on campaign money to tell working people they deserve better. He looked directly into Ocasio-Cortez's eyes with a piercing intensity. They do deserve better, Congresswoman. They deserve better than you. That single devastating sentence landed like a bomb in a vast room that had completely forgotten how to properly react. Up in the public gallery, an older, weathered man, sitting rigidly in the 3rd row, slowly removed his eyeglasses and carefully placed them deep into his front shirt pocket. It was the profound, deliberate motion of a grounded person who had instantly decided that what he was currently hearing absolutely did not require seeing any more clearly, only hearing much more carefully. Desperate for a lifeline, Ocasio-Cortez's right hand twitched and moved toward the thick stack of papers resting in front of her, desperately sifting through her comprehensive 3 one-page briefing materials on State Department operations, U.S. aid restructuring, and complex Venezuela policy. But absolutely nothing contained within those dense policy pages addressed the reality of luxury hotel rooms, exhausted housekeepers, or the highly specific, devastating number 483. Rubio wasn't finished. In fact, he was merely shifting into a higher gear. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you genuinely believe in democratic socialism. Maybe the hotels and the private jets and the $35,000 gala tickets are just, what was the phrase? The cost of doing the people's work? He hypothesized smoothly. Except there's an email. He deliberately did not reach into his jacket to produce a printed document, choosing instead to recite the contents entirely from memory, knowing that the very act of flawlessly reciting rather than reading carried its own immense psychological weight. It implicitly meant he had studied this specific email enough times to burn it into his memory, which ultimately meant it had deeply mattered to him, proving this was absolutely not just standard political opposition research, but something much closer to profound personal offense. Your campaign strategist wrote to you in March 2023. Subject line, Messaging Framework Q2, he recalled flawlessly. One line stood out, don't define democratic socialism. Let people fill in their own meaning. The moment we get specific, we lose the suburbs. He repeated the damning instruction to let it echo off the mahogany walls. Don't define it. That's not a political philosophy, Congresswoman. That's a marketing strategy. You're not selling a system, you're selling a brand. He leaned in, twisting the knife. And the people buying it, the people in the Bronx, the people cleaning hotel rooms, the people taking 2 buses to work, they think they're buying a revolution, they're buying a logo. Ocasio-Cortez immediately opened her mouth to forcefully interject and respond, but Rubio was already swiftly moving on, not physically shifting, but narratively surging forward with the unstoppable force of a deep current, violently pulling the entire oxygen-starved room right along with him. I want to tell you about a woman named Elena Vargas, he stated, intentionally dropping his vocal pitch by half a register, ensuring it wasn't a weak whisper, but rather the intimate, grounded tone a serious man uses exclusively when he is talking about a real person he genuinely knows, not an abstract case study he has merely read about. Elena is Cuban Miami. Her mother came over in 1980, the Mariel boat lift. Her mother cleaned hotel rooms for 23 years. Rubio painted the grim reality of the American dream suffocating under political rhetoric. Elena opened a nail salon on 8th Street, 4 chairs, a nail dryer, and a lease she co-signed with her cousin because the bank wouldn't approve her alone. In 2019, Elena applied for a small business loan to expand. 4 more chairs, 1 more employee. The bank turned her down. He delivered the cold rejection. The loan officer said, "The political climate around corporate investment is uncertain." Elena said, "I'm not a corporation. I have 4 chairs and a nail dryer." Rubio stared directly at the woman sitting above him, delivering the brutal verdict. Elena didn't lose her loan because of a policy. She lost it because you spent 2 years making the word business sound like the word criminal. When you tell the country that corporations are the enemy, the banks don't hear Amazon. They hear Elena's nail salon on 8th Street. He strategically let the powerful image sit heavy in the silent room. The tiny nail salon, the 4 modest chairs, the ambitious woman who only wanted 4 more, and who was coldly told no by an overly cautious financial institution that had heard a powerful congresswoman viciously scream the word oligarchy enough times on television to become terrified of approving a tiny small business loan. Elena's mother cleaned hotel rooms for 23 years so her daughter could own something. 1 small shop, 4 chairs, Rubio noted gravely. And a woman in Washington who has never cleaned a room in her life took that away, not with a law, but with a microphone. Up in the gallery, a visibly shaken woman sitting near the central aisle immediately opened her smartphone, purposely not to record a viral video, but to urgently dial someone. She quickly stood up, rushed to the hallway, and practically pressed the phone through her ear, executing the desperate motion of a stunned person who had just witnessed something so monumental they needed to instantly repeat it to someone who was not physically in the room. But Rubio was far from finished. But the Congresswoman is not anti-business. Not really. Not when the cameras are off, he continued smoothly. At a private fundraiser in Manhattan, $1,000 a plate, which is approximately 138 hours of my mother's labor. If anyone's counting, the Congresswoman told a room of donors, "Look, I know the rhetoric can sound aggressive, but we're not coming for your money. We're coming for the system. There's a difference." He let the deeply hypocritical quote breathe in the dead air. "We're not coming for your money. That's what you tell the people who write the checks. The people cleaning their apartments get a different speech." He shook his head, rendering judgment. 2 speeches, Congresswoman. 1 for the people who pay, and 1 for the people who vote. In Cuba, we had a word for that. My grandfather used it on the porch. I won't translate it. This is a congressional hearing, but the word exists and it fits. For 3 agonizing seconds, the massive hearing room existed in a state of absolute, breathless suspension, with every single person present hyper-aware that whatever visceral action happened next would permanently determine whether the last 10 explosive minutes had merely been a masterful political performance or a total, devastating reckoning. Faced with obliteration, Ocasio-Cortez actively chose a reckoning. She chose to brawl. She forcefully rose from her high-backed leather chair, deploying the exact same physical power move she had successfully used 100 times before, executing the dramatic geometry shift that immediately forces the television camera upward and artificially makes the standing speaker appear vastly larger and more dominant. But this specific time, the aggressive physical action carried a heavy emotional weight it had never carried before. Raw necessity. She was no longer standing up to assert dominance. She was standing up solely because remaining seated suddenly felt exactly like conceding total defeat. "Mr. Secretary," she projected loudly as her voice finally found the authentic, soaring register that had made her a global phenomenon, the unique, powerful register that seamlessly blended the grit of the Bronx with the grand theatricality of the floor of Congress, the exact tone that made dense policies sound intimately personal and the personal sound aggressively political. "I have sat here and listened to you lecture me about your mother and your family and your grandfather's porch, and I respect your family's story. I do," she declared fiercely. She sharply turned her body toward the crowded gallery, fully reclaiming her preferred stage, doing exactly what she arguably did better than anyone else in the entire United States Congress, speaking past the immediate adversary to the room beyond the room, directly into the glowing camera lenses, and right to the people watching at home. "But let me tell you something. You don't have a monopoly on the immigrant experience," she challenged. "My family came from Puerto Rico. My mother cleaned houses. My father died when I was 19. I worked as a bartender. Same job as your father, Mr. Secretary." She hammered the podium, tapping into deep, working-class resentment. "I stood behind a bar and poured drinks for people who didn't look at me. So don't sit in that chair and act like the only person in this room who understands sacrifice." She was rapidly building incredible momentum now, aggressively accelerating her vocal cadence, masterfully stacking her sentences on top of each other, and perfectly riding the intoxicating rhythm that had previously electrified massive rally stages, dominated high-stakes hearing rooms, and flooded Instagram live streams with the exact raw energy that made 3 0-year-olds rush out to register to vote and forced 6 0-year-old mainstream columnists to breathlessly write endless think pieces about her being the undisputed future of the Democratic Party. The difference between you and me is not where we came from. The difference is what we decided to do about it. She climaxed brilliantly. You decided to serve the people who stay at the hotels. I decided to fight for the people who clean them. Upon that devastating line, the Democrats seated on the dais completely erupted in validation. 3 prominent senators applauded entirely openly, while Senator Blumenthal aggressively struck the heavy wooden table with the flat of his palm in total approval. Down in the frenzied press row, an ecstatic CNN producer instantly marked the time code on her monitor and frantically texted her senior editor in New York, "Get this on the 6." The massive public gallery was instantly deeply divided, with exactly half loudly applauding, while the other stunned half simply sat frozen, silently watching the other half applaud. For one fleeting, brilliant moment, the entire room once again thoroughly belonged to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The broadcast camera absolutely loved her. The resulting soundbite clip was flawlessly clean, and the political performance was, by any objective metric, undeniably extraordinary. Marco Rubio simply waited, allowing the deafening partisan applause to die down and 3 heavy seconds to agonizingly tick by before pressing his palms firmly back onto the wooden table. What began as the defensive brace of a weary witness had mutated into the relaxed posture of a predator ready to finish his opponent off. Staring up through the suffocating silence, he acknowledged Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's fiery claim of fighting for the working class before dropping an 8-word tactical nuke. "Then why didn't you pay them?" The crowded chamber violently contracted as Rubio unleashed the documented facts, exposing how the politician claiming to champion the working class had left her Met Gala hairstylist, a small four-employee agency, unpaid for months, while actively ignoring 3 desperate payment requests. He laid bare the gross hypocrisy of her performative compassion, softly noting that while they both had bartender fathers, his immigrant father would never stiff someone for their grueling labor. Utterly paralyzed, Ocasio-Cortez watched her tax the rich facade crumble as the Secretary of State delivered the final blow with chilling diplomatic gentleness. Flawlessly reciting an internal memo from memory, he exposed her embarrassing geographical ignorance at the Munich Security Conference, where she had confidently placed Venezuela below the equator, masterfully contrasting her hollow theatrics with the grounded reality of his refugee mother. As the merciless 5-minute timer chimed, the architectural power dynamic of the room fully inverted. Stripped of her bravado and terrified of what unseen ammunition Rubio might deploy next, Ocasio-Cortez raised a humiliating parliamentary white flag, muttering a defeated "I yield" back to the man she had mocked just moments prior. The political aftermath was catastrophic for the Congresswoman, whose panic damage control alienated her Hispanic base and tanked her approval ratings, while Rubio's visceral defense organically exploded across the internet, resonating deeply with working-class immigrants from national Telemundo broadcasts to sun-drenched Miami nail salons. Emerging victorious from the chaotic Capitol, Rubio bypassed the frenzied press corps with a single, grounded directive to his aide: "Call my mom first." Yet, as he slipped into the silent sanctuary of his armored black SUV, the Secretary of State abruptly shattered every strict security protocol. Handing his driver coordinates to a highly classified, undisclosed location, Rubio vanished from the grid, leaving his panic-stricken detail completely unaware that this sudden, off-the-books detour was about to detonate a massive global geopolitical crisis before the stroke of midnight.